The barn sat wide and weathered against the horizon. Its red paint faded into a brownish hue where years of sun and storm had beaten it down. To anyone passing through, it might have looked too big for its own good, an empty shell of timber that once held more hay and horses than it ever could now. But for folks who lived in this small village tucked at the edge of the prairie, it wasn't just a barn. It was the heartbeat of stories whispered between the rows of corn, the meeting place of laughter, and sometimes the keeper of secrets best left in shadows. And tonight, as the crickets hummed their low hymn and the lantern light trembled against its boards, that barn felt far too large, too hollow, unless you counted the company within it. Life in the late 1800s didn't move in haste here. Dust rose with each wagon wheel along the main road, carrying with it the faint sound of boots scuffing over wooden porches and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing down the lane. The village was small enough that everyone's business was known, yet large enough that some business could be tucked away if one knew where to look. The general store leaned at the corner, its windows stacked with jars of penny candy and coffee beans that perfumed the air. The church bell called out on Sundays, steady and true. And out past the square, farmland stretched as far as the eye could see, golden wheat fields broken by fences and the occasional oak tree that had refused to bow to axe or storm. It was on one of those farms, just beyond the split-rail fence, where the barn stood. Folks always said it was too big for just one family. Wide enough to fit more wagons than most farmers would own, tall enough for the roof to catch the moonlight like a beacon. And maybe that was why it seemed both a blessing and a burden. It was full of echoes, echoes of laughter, echoes of arguments, echoes of the past. For the farmer's daughter, it was the place where childhood games had been played, where she'd hidden away from chores, and where dreams were whispered in silence no one else could hear. She was no child now, though she often still carried herself with the stubborn spark of one. Her hair carried the shine of corn silk, and her eyes held a steadiness that didn't falter, even when wagons of strangers rolled into town. She knew how to mend fence wire, how to read the clouds for rain, and how to stand her ground when anyone thought her weaker for the way her skirts brushed the dirt. Folks said she had her father's grit, but there was something softer too, something she kept hidden like wildflowers pressed in the pages of a book. It was that same softness that made the cowboy notice her the first evening he rode through. He wasn't from around here, anyone could tell. Dust clung to his coat like he'd ridden more miles than the horse ought to bear, and his boots carried the weary sound of someone who had no place to call home. But he had a grin too, one that showed he wasn't afraid of the world, not yet. He worked where work was offered, never staying long enough for roots to take hold. Folks whispered about him, as they did about anyone unfamiliar, but he didn't mind. He was used to being a story on someone else's tongue. That night, as the sun folded itself beneath the horizon and the barn filled with a golden haze from the lantern swinging overhead, the cowboy leaned against one of the beams and let his voice cut through the silence. "This barn's too big to feel empty," he said, his words carrying a lazy humor. His eyes, though, rested steady on the farmer's daughter as if to tell her the jest wasn't meant for everyone, unless you're here with me. The tease was light-hearted, but it landed heavier than he likely intended. She paused in her step, her hands full with the bucket she'd been carrying. For a moment, the only sound was the drip of water from the rim, each drop darkening the dust beneath her boots. She studied him, trying to weigh the truth behind his words. Cowboys were known for their easy charm, the kind that could win a laugh or a favor without much effort. But something about his tone made her wonder if there wasn't more stitched between the lines. Outside, the night stretched quiet, the stars pressing close like curious eyes. The fields breathed their soft rhythm, and the wooden walls seemed to lean inward, as though they too were waiting for what might come next. She shifted the bucket aside and let her voice answer, careful and calm. A barn don't need filling if you know how to use the space right. It wasn't a laugh, not a blush, but neither was a dismissal. The cowboy's grin deepened, though his eyes still held that flicker of seriousness. He stepped closer, boots stirring the dust, the boards creaking under his weight. "Maybe so," he said, "but some places feel different when they're shared." For a moment, the distance between them narrowed, not just in steps but in silence. The lantern light caught her profile, softening the edges of her resolve, and the air seemed to shift in a way that carried unspoken promise. But the night was young, and promises had a way of bending before they were kept. She turned her gaze toward the open barn door, where the fields waited in shadow. "Best not linger long," she said, though her voice wasn't as firm as she wanted it to be. "Father don't take kindly to strangers hanging about." The cowboy let out a low chuckle, though he didn't move back. "Guess I'll have to prove I'm worth the trouble then." What neither of them noticed was the figure standing not far from the barn, hidden just beyond the edge of the oak tree, watching, listening, waiting. The night held more than just whispers and teases. It held the weight of choices not yet made, and consequences that might soon follow. And as the lantern swayed, throwing long shadows against the barn walls, the space no longer felt empty. It felt alive, thick with tension, and carrying the kind of silence that could be broken in ways neither the cowboy nor the farmer's daughter could yet imagine. The night deepened around the barn, the chorus of crickets loud enough to drown most thoughts, but not enough to settle the unease that drifted in the air. The farmer's daughter lingered near the doorway, her eyes on the horizon, though her mind was caught on the words the cowboy had left hanging. She had known men like him before, drifters who came with the season, looking for work and leaving before the dust had time to settle. They rarely stayed long enough to care about the people they met. Yet something about his gaze felt different, something that pressed against the guarded walls she'd built over the years. Inside, the cowboy leaned back against the wooden beam as if he belonged there, though the barn itself seemed to protest his presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every sway of the lantern made the space feel heavy with waiting. He was careful with his words now, saying little, watching more. His silence was not empty, though it was the kind that weighed down the air, the kind that asked questions without needing to speak them. The figure outside shifted in the dark, unseen by either of them. He had been standing there long before. The cowboy's voice carried across the barn, watching through the narrow cracks in the boards. His eyes narrowed each time he caught the sound of their voices. He knew this land too well, and he had his reasons for keeping a close watch. The farm held more than just fields of grain. It carried old debts, old grudges, and the kind of history that didn't die easy. The cowboy, with his charm and laughter, had no idea what kind of ground he was stepping on. The farmer's daughter bent to gather the bucket again, though her movement slowed as if she was buying herself time. "You ought to find a bed in town," she said, her voice steady but not sharp. "There's no room here for you." "Don't worry," the cowboy replied, tilting his hat back just enough for the lantern light to brush across his face. "I've slept under stars far less kind than these. But I figured if a barn this big's got space, maybe it could spare a corner for a tired soul." She shook her head, though not with anger. "It ain't about space, it's about belonging." The cowboy's grin softened, though the edge of it never left. "And what does it take to belong around here?" Her answer caught in her throat, because she didn't know herself. Folks in the village held on to their ways, slow to let anyone in, quicker still to cast them out. Belonging wasn't something you asked for. It was something earned over years of labor, of shared hardships and trust built plank by plank, like the very barn they stood in. And yet, she found herself without words, standing in the glow of lantern light with a stranger who made her heart stumble against the silence. Outside, the hidden figure clenched his jaw. The cowboy's presence was more than a nuisance. It was a danger. He turned back toward the fields, fading into the night with steps so quiet even the crickets didn't hush. Whatever plan he carried with him, it would not wait long. The village itself wasn't blind to newcomers. The next morning, whispers carried across the square as soon as the cowboy set foot into the general store. Folks noticed the way he carried himself, easy but not careless, with a gait that showed he'd seen long roads and harder days. He tipped his hat to the shopkeeper, bought himself some jerky and coffee grounds, and spoke with the kind of charm that made old Mrs. Cartwright at the counter blush like a girl half her age. Yet not everyone welcomed the sight. The blacksmith frowned from the doorway, arms crossed, his hammer still warm from the forge. A stranger meant uncertainty, and in a place like this, uncertainty was unwelcome. The farmer's daughter walked into town later that day, carrying eggs to trade, and she felt the shift in the air as eyes turned from her to the cowboy. It wasn't the first time she'd been the subject of small-town talk, but she knew that way stories grew faster than weeds. She kept her head high, though her heart beat quicker when she caught the cowboy's nod from across the store. He didn't say a word to her, but the silent acknowledgement was enough to stir the whispers louder. By evening, the barn once again stood at the center of it all. Its wide doors were cracked open, letting the last streaks of orange sunset spill across the dirt floor. The farmer's daughter had returned with her chores done, but the day's weight clung to her shoulders. She didn't expect him to be there again, yet she wasn't surprised when his silhouette leaned against the beam, just as it had the night before. "You don't give up easy, do you?" she said, setting down her basket. "Depends on what's worth fighting for," he replied, his voice calm but firm. She wanted to laugh, to brush it off as another tease, but something in his tone made her pause. The cowboy wasn't just here for shelter or food. He was searching for something, maybe a reason to stay, maybe a piece of himself he'd lost along the road. She didn't know, and maybe he didn't either. The lantern flickered, and the shadows deepened along the rafters. Outside, the wind carried the distant howl of a coyote, a lonely sound that curled into the silence between them. The farmer's daughter felt the weight of the barn pressing in, not with emptiness this time, but with the strange fullness of possibilities she couldn't yet name. She turned her eyes to him, steady and unflinching. "If you mean to stay, you'll have to prove yourself." This farm seemed too many promises left broken. The cowboy gave a slow nod, as though he understood more than her words revealed. "Then maybe it's time someone kept one." The silence after that felt thick, carrying more than either of them dared speak. But while they measured one another, the night beyond their walls carried its own story. The man who had watched from the oak tree was not gone for good. He was planning, waiting for the right moment. And when it came, the barn, the farm, and everyone tied to it would feel the storm he carried with him. The farmer's daughter didn't yet know, the danger pressing closer with each passing night. She didn't know that the cowboy's arrival wasn't just chance, but part of a thread woven long before either of them stepped into that barn. She only knew that for the first time, the barn didn't feel too big, too empty, or too lonely. And that was enough to keep her standing there, caught between fear and curiosity, wondering what tomorrow might bring. The lantern swung once more, shadows twisting across the walls, and the night seemed to hold its breath. Neither of them noticed the faint crack of a branch just beyond the door, nor the watchful eyes fixed on them with a patience that promised trouble. And so the barn, old and wide, filled again with echoes, not just of laughter or whispers, but of something heavier, something waiting. The story was just beginning, and the silence that lingered was only the calm before a storm neither could stop. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary on the surface, but the undercurrent beneath it told a different story. The cowboy kept finding his way back to the barn, whether to lend a hand with chores or simply to stand in the lantern light at dusk. He didn't force conversation, but when he spoke, his words carried the kind of weight that stuck. The farmer's daughter grew restless in his presence, torn between the instinct to guard her heart and the quiet pull of curiosity that urged her closer. Each night she told herself it would be the last time she let him linger, yet each night he was there, leaning against the same post as though the barn had claimed him too, but outside of their quiet exchanges, the world was less forgiving. The villagers noticed. In a place where news traveled faster than a runaway horse, whispers sharpened into warnings. At the general store, she overheard Mrs. Cartwright clucking her tongue, saying no good ever came from strangers who smiled too easily. The blacksmith grumbled about drifters who left debts unpaid, his hammer ringing sharper that day as if to drive the point home. Even the preacher's wife gave her a look that lingered too long, heavy with judgment disguised as concern. The farmer's daughter felt those eyes pressing down on her, but she held her chin high. What they didn't see, what they couldn't know, was that the cowboy's presence felt like more than danger. It felt like a spark she hadn't realized she'd been missing. What she didn't know was that the stranger who had been watching from the oak tree was still out there, and he hadn't left for good. His name carried no weight in the village anymore, for folks believed him long gone, but his ties to the land ran deep. Years back, before the barn stood so proud, before the fields yielded as they did now, he had been close to the farm. Some said he had been cheated out of what was his. Others said his own choices drove him away. Whatever the truth, the bitterness had settled in his bones, and when he saw the cowboy leaning close to the farmer's daughter, it wasn't just jealousy, it was fury. The first sign came in small ways. A fence post split overnight, leaving cattle to wander close to the road. The water trough was found tipped and empty one morning, though no storm had passed through. A shadow was seen slipping across the field at dusk, but by the time the dogs barked, there was no trace left behind. The farmer's daughter knew these things weren't accidents. She felt the prickle of unease at the back of her neck whenever she walked alone to the barn, as though eyes followed her every step. When she confided in the cowboy, he didn't laugh or shrug it off. His jaw tightened, and he scanned the fields with the kind of practiced caution of a man who had seen danger before. "I don't like the feel of it," he said one evening, his voice low, steady. "Somebody's trying to shake this place apart piece by piece." She swallowed hard. "Then why keep coming here?" "You don't owe us nothing." "Maybe I don't," he answered, his eyes meeting hers. "But maybe I owe myself a chance not to keep running." His words lingered long after, and she wondered what kind of roads he had traveled to make him say such a thing. Meanwhile, the farmer himself remained unaware of just how close the danger pressed. He noticed the broken fence, the tipped trough, but he muttered about careless hands and shrugged it off. His faith was in hard work, not in suspicion. He was a man who believed land tested you with hardship, and if you pushed back hard enough, the land gave way. But the cowboy knew better. Not every battle came from the soil. Some came from men with grudges deep as drought. The hidden figure grew bolder as the night stretched longer. One evening, the farmer's daughter thought she saw a lantern flicker out by the far field, far too late for anyone honest to be working. Another night, the dogs whined and scratched at the barn door, restless until dawn. Each sign pushed her closer to unease, but it also pushed her closer to the cowboy, who never failed to appear just when she needed steady company. His presence gave her courage, though she never admitted it aloud. Yet not all conflict lay in shadows. Inside the village, a different storm brewed. The blacksmith's son, a young man quick to temper and slow to think, had long held his eye on the farmer's daughter. Her indifference to him had soured into something sharper over the years. Now, seeing her exchange glances with the cowboy, his resentment burned hotter. He muttered in the tavern, saying the drifter was bound to bring ruin, that no good man lingered where he wasn't wanted. A few others agreed, their voices stirring like dry leaves in the wind. Resentment turned to talk, and talk threatened to turn to action. The farmer's daughter sensed it but said nothing. She carried herself with the same stubborn grit she always had, tending to chores, keeping her head high when she walked through town. But at night, when the barn doors closed and the lantern swayed, she let herself breathe differently, let herself lean just slightly into the quiet comfort the cowboy offered. She didn't know what he was running from or why he chose this farm to linger, but she felt the truth in his eyes that whatever roads had shaped him, he was tired of moving on. Still, the danger pressing in from the fields wasn't fading. One evening, while the sky burned orange with sunset, they found the barn door left wide open, though neither of them had touched it. Inside, a rake lay snapped in two, as though broken in anger, and fresh boot prints marked the dust. The farmer's daughter stood frozen, her breath caught. The cowboy crouched low, tracing the prints with his fingers. His expression darkened, his voice tight. "Whoever it is, they ain't hiding anymore." The weight of those words pressed heavy. She knew then that this was no small mischief, no harmless warning. Someone wanted them afraid. Someone wanted them cornered. The cowboy rose, his shoulders squared, his gaze sweeping the shadows gathering at the edges of the field. "If this barn's too big to feel empty," he said quietly, echoing his earlier tease but with no jest, "this time, then it's sure big enough to hold trouble." The farmer's daughter tightened her grip on the lantern handle, her knuckles white. She didn't answer, because she knew he was right. The conflict spread like wildfire, though most of the village remained blind to its spark. The blacksmith's son stirred talk in the tavern, hinting the cowboy was to blame for the unrest, saying the farm had known peace before he arrived. Meanwhile, the hidden figure circled closer, his grudge growing heavier with each passing night. And between it all stood the farmer's daughter, caught in the pull of loyalty to her family, the judgment of her neighbors, and the undeniable draw of the stranger who refused to walk away. The barn itself seemed to hold its breath each night they met there, its rafters thick with shadows, its walls alive with tension. Every creak of the wood sounded louder, every gust of wind through the cracks felt like a warning. Yet neither of them stepped back. The farmer's daughter refused to yield her ground, and the cowboy refused to leave her to face it alone. Still, the question hung heavier with each day. Who was the figure in the dark, and how far would he go to claim what he believed was his? The answer lingered just out of reach, like a storm building beyond the horizon. And when it finally broke, no one in the village, not the farmer, not his daughter, not even the cowboy, would escape untouched. The night came down thick, the lantern flickering in the barn, and the silence between them was broken only by the sound of the wind pressing against the doors. Somewhere in that silence, both of them knew they were standing on the edge of something that couldn't be turned back. The only question left was how long before the storm struck. The barn no longer felt like a simple shelter of wood and nails. Each night it became a stage where silence and shadows pressed too close, where every creak of the boards seemed to whisper of something watching. The farmer's daughter carried her lantern with a tighter grip now, her eyes darting toward the open fields each time the wind rustled the wheat. She told herself she wasn't afraid, but the way her heart thudded faster at each sound betrayed the truth. And always, the cowboy was there, steady as the post he leaned against, his calm voice steadying her when the unease grew too heavy. But the village was not calm. The blacksmith's son had stirred talk until it boiled over into suspicion. By the tavern hearth, men leaned in close, muttering that the drifter was to blame for the mischief haunting the farm. They said he must be the one sneaking through the fields at night, unsettling cattle, breaking tools, and setting unease on honest folk. A stranger with no roots was easy to blame. And once the seed of suspicion was planted, it spread quickly. The farmer himself began to hear it too. He came in from the fields one afternoon, jaw set, his eyes heavy with doubt. "That cowboy," he muttered to his daughter, "he lingers too long here. Folks are talking. They say trouble follows men like him." She stood her ground, her voice steady though her stomach twisted. Trouble was here before him. Can't you see it? Her father sighed, his weathered hands rubbing his brow. He was a man who believed in soil, sweat, and truth that came plain, not hidden behind riddles. "All I see is a stranger under my roof and whispers on every tongue." That night, she went to the barn with her lantern, her resolve sharper than before. The cowboy waited in his usual place, but his smile was faint, worn down by the weight of the talk he had heard in town. "They're ready to run me out," he said simply. "Then why don't you go?" She asked, not accusing but aching for an answer. "Because if I do, whoever's out there wins. And I reckon you're left alone to carry what you shouldn't have to." Her throat tightened at his words. She knew he spoke truth, but it frightened her all the same. His presence brought comfort, but it also brought a storm that felt closer. Every night, the hidden figure, once content to lurk in shadows, had begun to press closer, bolder. Twice now she had seen his outline at the edge of the fields, the lantern light catching the brim of a hat before he melted back into the dark. One morning, the family awoke to find a knife driven deep into the barn door, its handle quivering in the wood as if set there with rage. The farmer's daughter touched the blade with trembling fingers before pulling her hand back. It was a warning, clear as words carved in stone. The cowboy studied it with narrowed eyes, his jaw clenched. "This ain't mischief anymore. He's telling us he's close." The farmer's daughter could feel the change in the air. Every hour seemed stretched thin, every sound amplified, like the world was holding its breath. She moved through her chores with the unease of someone walking a path they couldn't see the end of. The fields, once a place of calm, now felt like open plains where danger could rise from any corner. The tension in the village thickened. Too, children whispered about ghosts haunting the farm. Women shook their heads when the farmer's daughter walked past, their voices low but their eyes sharp. Men gathered at the blacksmith's forge, their talk harder each time. Some wanted the sheriff called, others muttered that they should take matters into their own hands. And through it all, the blacksmith's son fed the fire, his own jealousy. Twisting into poison. One evening, the cowboy came into town alone. He walked through the tavern doors, the air inside already buzzing with voices, and every eye turned to him. He didn't falter, though. He stood at the counter, his voice calm as he asked for nothing more than a meal and a place to sit. But the silence that followed told him enough. They didn't trust him, and some already hated him. The blacksmith's son leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking as though daring the cowboy to speak. The tension cracked when a voice shouted, "Why don't you ride on, stranger? This ain't your fight." The cowboy set down his fork, slow and measured. His voice came steady, quiet but sharp enough to cut through the room. "Maybe it is. Maybe it's everyone's fight when a man thinks he can stalk fields and scare families into fear." The blacksmith's son pushed forward, his voice rising. "Or maybe the only one stirring trouble is you. Ever since you came, nothing's been right." The tavern filled with murmurs, some agreeing, some uncertain. The cowboy met the young man's glare with an even gaze, saying nothing more. He knew words alone wouldn't shift minds that had already chosen what they wanted to believe. He left before fists or worse could follow, but he felt the heat of their stares burning into his back all the way out the door. That night, the barn was different. The lantern light seemed weaker, the shadows thicker, and the silence stretched taut. The farmer's daughter was already there, waiting, her hands wringing against her skirts. She saw the strain in his eyes before he said a word. "They're turning," he told her. "If something don't give soon, they'll come here and they won't ask questions." Her breath caught, but before she could answer, a sound split. The night, a sharp crack from the far field, like a branch snapping under heavy weight. Both turned toward the sound, the cowboy already reaching for the knife he kept at his side. The lantern swayed, throwing wild shadows across the walls, and the barn itself felt alive with the tension. "Stay here," he whispered, though she stepped forward as if to follow. "I'm not hiding," she shot back, her voice low but fierce. Before either could move further, another sound carried across the field, this time a low whistle, drawn out and mocking. It sent a chill straight through the boards of the barn. Whoever lurked in the dark was no longer content with shadows. He was calling them out, daring them to step into the open. The cowboy's eyes flicked to hers, steady but sharp. "It's starting." The farmer's daughter gripped the lantern tighter, her knuckles white, her breath caught between fear and fire. She felt the truth of it in her bones. The storm wasn't waiting on the horizon anymore, it was at their door, pressing closer with each heartbeat. The field stretched wide and silent, save for the steady whistle fading into laughter. That carried on the wind. The barn walls groaned, the night thickened, and every thread of unease wound tighter until it threatened to snap. The farmer's daughter and the cowboy stood side by side, caught in the center of a storm ready to break open. And in the dark, just beyond the reach of lantern light, the figure watched with eyes that gleamed cold as steel. He was ready. The game he had been playing was over. Now came the strike. The whistle died into silence, and for a long moment the world held its breath. The cowboy and the farmer's daughter stood side by side in the barn doorway, the lantern trembling. In her hand, its glow spilling just far enough to show the edge of the fields, but not the danger waiting beyond. The night smelled of dust and wheat, the air tight with the kind of tension that makes a person's skin prickle. Then came another. Sound boots crunching against dry soil, steady. Deliberate doubt. The cowboy stepped forward first, his voice calm but loud enough to carry. "Show yourself." From the dark, a figure emerged, his hat low, his shoulders squared. The lantern's light caught his face, worn and hard, his eyes sharp with a bitterness that seemed to burn hotter than fire. The farmer's daughter felt her stomach twist as recognition struck her. She had seen this man before, years ago, though she'd been a child then. He had worked alongside her father once, until a quarrel drove him off. Folks said he'd left for good, but clearly the land had never let him go. "You've built your life on what should have been mine," the man growled, his voice thick with anger. "This farm, this barn, it was promised. And now you let some drifter stand where I should have stood?" His gaze cut to the cowboy with a venom that left no doubt why he'd returned. The farmer's daughter lifted her chin, her voice trembling but strong. "You left. You gave it up yourself." The man's laugh was sharp, bitter. "I was pushed out. Your father saw to that." His hand twitched near the knife at his belt. "Now I'll take back what I'm owed." The cowboy stepped between him and the girl, his posture steady, his tone firm. "You want to settle old grudges, you look at the man who made them. Don't drag her into it." The hidden figure's eyes narrowed. "You don't belong here. None of this is yours." "Why?" "Fight for it?" The cowboy's reply came without hesitation. "Because belonging ain't always about land or names. Sometimes it's about standing where you're needed." The words hung heavy in the air. The farmer's daughter felt her breath catch, not just from fear, but from the truth in what he said. For all his drifting, for all the whispers in town, the cowboy stood firm when it mattered most. The moment snapped like a taut rope. The figure lunged forward, his knife glinting in the lantern light. The cowboy met him with a force born of grit and instinct, their struggle crashing into the dirt. at the barn's threshold. The farmer's daughter stumbled back, her lantern swinging wildly, throwing frantic shadows across the walls. The sounds of the fight filled the night, boots scraping, fists striking, wood groaning under the weight of men locked in struggle. She wanted to scream, to run, but instead she grabbed the broken rake handle left from the earlier sabotage. Her hand shook, but her grip tightened. When the figure shoved the cowboy back and raised his knife, she stepped forward with all the courage she could summon, striking the handle hard across the man's arm. The blade flew from his grasp, clattering into the dirt. The cowboy surged forward, pinning the man down, his chest heaving with the effort. For a long moment, all that could be heard was heavy breathing and the frantic creak of the lantern swaying above. Then, slowly, the fight drained out of the figure. His eyes, still burning with rage, flicked to the girl, then to the cowboy. He spat into the dirt. "This ain't over." The cowboy pressed harder, his voice calm but sharp as steel. "It is tonight. You'll leave, and you won't come back. This land don't want you anymore." The man's body slackened, his fury fading into defeat. He muttered something low, too quiet to catch, before the cowboy let him rise. Staggering, the figure disappeared into the fields, swallowed by the dark he had come from. The barn fell silent, save for the wind pressing through the cracks. The farmer's daughter sank onto a bale of hay, her lantern now dimming, her body trembling with the weight of what had just passed. The cowboy crouched beside her, his voice softer now. "You did right. You stood your ground." Her eyes searched his, still wide with fear but steadying. "So did you. You didn't have to." He gave a tired smile, the edges worn but true. "Maybe I did. Maybe I needed to." By morning, the story had already spread through the village. Some said the drifter saved the farm. Others grumbled that he had brought danger to their doorstep. But the farmer himself, seeing the broken knife at the barn door and the bruises on the cowboy's face, knew the truth of it. For the first time, he offered the cowboy more than suspicion. He offered thanks. The blacksmith's son scowled when he heard, but his voice held less sway now. Folks had seen with their own eyes who had stood firm when trouble pressed close. Whispers still carried, but they softened into acceptance, if not trust. In time, the village would remember less the danger and more the way the farm endured. The farmer's daughter, the barn would never feel the same. It was no longer just the place of chores and echoes. It had become the place where fear had been faced, where strength had been found, and where a drifter proved himself not by words, but by standing when it mattered most. One evening, weeks later, she and the cowboy stood at the barn doors again, the lantern glowing soft in her hand. The field stretched wide under a quiet sky, no shadows lurking at the edges, no whistle carried on the wind. The silence was different now, not heavy, not tense, but calm. The cowboy leaned against the post, his familiar grin returning, though softer than before. "This barn's still too big," he said, "but I reckon it don't feel so empty anymore." She let out a small laugh, her eyes bright in the lantern glow. "Not when you're here." The moment hung between them, simple and honest. The storm had passed, the danger gone, but something stronger remained. Not promises written in stone, but the kind built in quiet moments, in choices made when the night pressed darkest. The barn creaked as if in agreement, its old beams holding steady, its wide doors open to whatever lay ahead. The farm still stood, the field still swayed, and the village still whispered, but the echoes inside the barn no longer felt hollow. They were filled with something real: courage, belonging, and the memory of a night when shadows gave way to light. And as the lantern burned steady, the farmer's daughter knew she would never see the barn as empty again. The cowboy, once a stranger, had found his place not in the land but in the people who needed him. And the farm, weathered by storms and guarded by grit, would hold its stories within its walls for years to come. The night closed soft around them, carrying the calm of a land that had endured, and in the quiet of the barn there was no emptiness. Left only the steady truth of a story come full circle, top of form, bottom of form.